Salvete omnes, and welcome to this week's video tutorial. This tutorial will also provide a good review and preparation for your first test this week. Here we have a reading of, or a text rather, of Pandora's box, the famous myth. Here we have a brief description, the story of Pandora and her curiosity is one of the most famous tales from classical mythology. Hesiod, ancient Greek writer, presents this version of the myth in his long didactic poem, Works and Days. You can see this accompanies wheel locks. You do not have this in your regular textbook. This is a supplemental reader. And the grammar that it assumes is verbs, first and second conjugation, present infinitive, indicative, imperative, nouns and cases, first declension, adjective, second declension. So in short, all of the grammar concepts that we have dealt with thus far. Here we have a lot of helpful vocabulary on the side. And of course, we can also use a dictionary, Whitaker's Words, to look up words. So again, this will be a good review of sort of where we're at conceptually, grammatically in Latin 101 this semester. So let's go ahead and read it here. So we have Iapetus duos filios Prometheum et Epimetheum habet. Prometheus est vir magnae sapientiae, Epimetheus vir sine sapientiae, Jupiter Epimeteo bellum feminam Pandoram dat. Prometheus Epimetheum de Pandora saepe monat. O Epimeteo, res, periculum non vedes? Non debes feminam ancipere, Epimetheus Pandoram amat de pericula non cogitat, Jupiter Epimeteo arcam dat, non licet arcam aprere, sed Pandora est curiosa. Quid in arce est, multa pecunia, magnus numeros gemarum, femini arcam apereit, multae formae mali provelant, et errant, sed Pandora spem in arce conservat, etiam si vitae plena malorum est, spem semper habimus. Again, it's a good idea to read it aloud. One of the big challenges in Latin is to sort of do it in piecemeal or chunk it, and that works in one sense, but we got to keep in mind that at one point in time Latin was a living language, and so just like a modern language, reading it aloud without thinking about it, just reading it, is going to help your proficiency. All right, so let's take a look here. So we have Iapetus, and here we're just going to follow our gloss right over here. Iapetus, one of the 12 titans, children of the earth, Gaia, and heaven, Uranus. And so that is the person's name, or the figure's name. And then duos filios, we'll see in a second, this means two sons, and then our verb all the way at the end, habet. So Iapetus has two sons, Prometheum and Epimetheum. So it's important to recognize, because this will be the concepts that you'll have to deal with on the test as well, is here we have duos filios, but then we have Prometheum and Epimetheum. So we have the os, and So if I go to our declensions here, which I've brought up here, you can see, see if I can put that up a little bit. There we go. So here's our os, and there's our Why? Because he has two sons, and as we pointed out in chapter 2, that is second declension accusative singular. Going back to chapter 1, the accusative is the direct object. Latin, of course, being an inflected language, it's all about the endings. And so, but then who are these sons? Well, then we have to put it in the singular. And of course, the sons are Epimetheus and Prometheum. Let me open up the text here. So, all right. So we put all together is that Iapetus has two sons, Prometheus and Epimetheus. Now, it is important that when we translate to put it back in the nominative. Why? Because English doesn't have cases, and so we would translate that with Prometheus and Epimetheus. And of course, here they tell us who they are, and you may know them from your previous readings or whatnot. So putting it all together, Iapetus has two sons, Prometheus and Epimetheus. And then it says, Prometheus es vir magnae sapientiae. So let's always go to the end of the punctuation if possible. And Prometheus is a man of great wisdom. So this one over here, they don't give us any vocabulary. Vir is the word for man. It's where we get words like virility and virile. Again, if we're not sure, I mentioned before, we can use Whitaker's words and just look that word up. You can see here, vir means man, husband, hero, person, honor, nobility. So probably go with man in this case is how we're going to do that. So Prometheus is a man. Now is where it gets a little bit trickier in one sense. So we have the magnae sapientiae. And so here we need to recognize that it's in the genitive. We talked about this earlier. AE, AE, AE. Only the context will tell you which one it is, but remember genitive generally means of, whereas dative means to or for. It's not in the plural, so that kind of eliminates that. So we put all together of great wisdom. As is often the case, you may have to do a little bit of trial and error to see which one works the best. So we translate that sentence, Prometheus is a man of great wisdom. Epimetheus is a man without wisdom. So here we have one of the nice things the Wheelox does do is it tends to repeat a lot of vocabularies that should help you. So here we have Prometheus is a man, Epimetheus is a man. But here we have the sine sapientiae. Now sine is the preposition for without. And again, if we're not sure on that, we would just look it up in our dictionary in the back of the book if we can't remember. So you can see sine, but sine is always used with the ablative. So whatever word that follows is going to have to be in the ablative case. So here we have sapientiae. So why is that the case? Well, because first declension ablative singular is a with the macron. So here we go, ablative singular, sapientiae. And we translate that as is without wisdom. So Prometheus is a man of great wisdom. Epimetheus is a man without wisdom. Jupiter, and of course Jupiter is the king of the gods. So Jupiter, Epimeteo bellum feminam Pandoram dat. So here's a good sentence. This is about as complex as we've gotten so far, but this will really test your knowledge of Latin grammar. So we have Jupiter to Epimetheus, beautiful woman Pandora gives. So again, Latin likes to put the verb at the end. We've had that before as one of our vocabulary words. That's where we get the word data. So third person singular, Jupiter gives. And then here's where it gets interesting. So here we had Epimetheus, but here we have Epimeteo. Why? Because when you give something to someone, that person is the indirect object. And in Latin, we put that in the dative case. So here we have Epimeteo because Jupiter's giving it to Epimetheus. But then what is he giving Epimetheus? Well, he's giving him a bellam feminam. So there's bellam, a beautiful woman. And so that is the direct object because accusative is direct object. So we go back to our reading here. You can see bellam feminam. And then Pandora, as we saw earlier with Prometheus and Epimetheus, that is a positive, if you will. And so that has to be in the same case as the context or syntax requires. So this one, we keep Pandora in the accusative singular because Pandora is the direct object. And so am for bellam feminam Pandoram. Again, pro trick or tip rather, if you see words that have the same ending or spelling, they probably go together. That can be helpful because there are times in Latin when the words are not next to each other. Here we have am, but Latin will often not provide us with that neat sequence. So put all together, Jupiter gives Epimetheus a beautiful woman, Pandora. Prometheus, Epimetium te Pandora saipe monet. Monet we had as one of our verbs earlier in chapter 2, I believe, and this means warns. It can also mean to advise if you admonish someone. So, for example, the mother is admonishing the child. Basically, of course, in English it often means scolding, but giving the child some advice not to do that because it could have certain consequences for behavior or society or whatnot. So here, warns, W-A-R-N-S would probably be the best translation. And so we have here, Prometheus warns Epimetheus often about Pandora. The adverbs you can kind of move around if you wanted to put it first. Often Prometheus warns Epimetheus about Pandora. It really doesn't matter for our purposes, but that is the adverb. And then look at the endings here. Here we have us and eum, and that tells us that Prometheus is the subject and Epimetheus is the direct object. So who's warning whom? Well, based on the endings, Prometheus is warning Epimetheus. But then we have about Pandora, because in Latin, when we use prepositions, we've talked about this before, that Latin requires certain prepositions. And so once again, de is always going to require the ablative. So the object that follows is going to be in the ablative. Sure enough, Pandora is in the ablative. Hence, we have the A with the macron over it. So if we go back to our Latin noun declensions, you can see Pandora has the macron because it's ablative singular first declension. So Prometheus often warns Epimetheus about Pandora. And what does he say? He says, oh, Epimetheus, literally, you are erring. In other words, you're making a mistake. So this one's actually in the vocative, which we haven't really talked about, but you can tell from the context that he's being spoken to. So, and then really interesting here, because this is an important concept in the first 3 chapters. Here we have the verb. Now, how do we know it's a verb? Well, the vocabulary tells us that. So we need to start learning the difference between verbs and nouns, and only careful study of the vocabulary would tell us that. If we're not sure, then of course we're going to have to look words up just like any other subject. And here you can see that eres is present, active, indicative, second person singular. These are the principal parts which are very important in Latin. Really, for our purposes, we're only doing the first 2 in Latin 101. But erro, errare, erravi, erratus probably is a good idea just to learn all 4. Means to wander, to go astray, to make a mistake, to err, to vacillate. So probably in English, you might say you are making a mistake. Notice that Latin has 1 word, whereas you are making a mistake. That's 5 words in English. So it's second person singular because it has S. So erro is I am making a mistake. Erres is you are making a mistake. Errat, at, is he or she or it is making a mistake. Erramos is we are making a mistake. Erratis, you all are making a mistake. Errant, E-R-R-A-N-T, they are making a mistake. But once again, you have to look at the vocab and choose the translation or the meaning that works best for that context. So Epimetheus, you are making a mistake. And what mistake is he making? That he does not see the danger. So here, periculum is danger. We talked before, it's kind of interesting. The word experience comes from danger. Just put an EX in front of it. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. If you want to play it safe, you won't have any experiences is the idea here. So periculum non veris, you do not see. So vedes is our verb here. Vedio, I see, vedes, you see, we it, he or she or it sees. And then keep it in present tense, because that's what it is. So you do not see the danger. And Prometheus continues, you ought not to accept the woman. So the woman from Jupiter. In other words, don't accept that gift from Jupiter. But here it just says not you ought, woman, accept. So here we have to kind of parse our words here. Daybase is you ought. So again, if we're not sure of that, we can look up our words here. And once again, second person singular. So debio is I ought, daybase, you ought, daybet, he, she, or it ought, debimus, we ought, debitis, you all ought, and debent, they ought. Okay, so must or should, you could say must as well. That would work in this context. So you should not accept the woman. So here we have feminam telling us that the woman is the direct object. And so that goes back to one of the important concepts we've been learning in the first 3 chapters. So Epimetheus ought not to accept her. And that's the accusative. By the way, the her or the him, that is kind of a holdover from Latin. In terms of English, H-E-R-H-I-M. So the endings indicate a change in meaning. We don't have that often in English, but believe it or not, those 2 pronouns do indicate a kind of inflection, if you will. And then this is just our infinitive to accept. And then Epimetheus loves Pandora. This one's pretty straightforward. So Epimetheus, that's our subject because it's second declension nominative singular. And then we've talked about how if it ends in am, that makes it the direct object. And we've had this verb in many of our readings so far. It's third person singular, amat, and it agrees with Epimetheus. Epimetheus loves the woman. And what happens because he loves her? Well, he is not thinking about the danger. So literally about the danger, not thinking. He is. So he is not thinking, cogitat, like cognition or cogitating, or cognitive science or cognitive neurology. So it has something to do. Descartes, cogito ergo sum, the famous French philosopher. So he is not thinking about the danger. Why? Because he's in love. And so here, of course, we have that classic theme of how love blinds our judgment in some manner. And of course, the fact that Jupiter is involved makes it a little bit more interesting or complex, but still that's the basic idea in human nature. And then Jupiter gives Epimetheus the box. So archam is box, like an ark. So Jupiter gives the ark to Epimetheus. So dative is to or for whom something is done. So in English, we could just say Jupiter gives Epimetheus the box, but it might be easier for the sake of learning Latin that he gives the box to Epimetheus. Why? Because the dative generally is to or for whom something is done. So that'll help reinforce that dative case if it ends in O in second declension singular in this instance. So Jupiter gives the box to Epimetheus, and he is not permitted to open the box. So here, this one's a little bit more complex based on the context, perhaps, but non-licet, it's where we get the word license, a license to drive, for example, license to kill, James Bond, L-E-C-E-T. And then what is not permitted to open, aperere, which is right here. Sometimes if you go to a formal dinner, you may have an aperitif, which is kind of a sherry or a brandy as a light drink. Just as you have hors d'oeuvres, you might have an aperitif, coming right from the Latin. And then archam tells us it's the direct object. So it's the object that is not permitted to be opened. So remember, the infinitive is just to, so to open. So he is not permitted to open the box. But Pandora is curious. Said Pandora es curiosa. So here's a good example where the adjective ends in A because the subject is A. Just for example, if we were saying that, let's say Epimetheus is curious, then what would it be? Yep, it would be Epimetheus es curiosus, it would end in us because it has to agree with the subject in its declension. But Pandora is curious, and she says, she asks, what is in the box? So quid in arche es? Important here perhaps is in arche because it is in the ablative. The ablative, as mentioned several times, is kind of the trickiest to learn. But if it's answering where is it, then we're going to need the ablative, and so that's why we have in arche. So what is in the box? And then a lot of money, multa pecunia, a large number of gems, and here we have some vocabulary over here. So a lot of money, a large number of gems. So notice of gems is first declension genitive plural. So that's why we say of gems, G-E-M-S. The woman opens the box. So femina aperit arcam. And what happens when she opens the box? Well, that many bad, now here we have forma provolant. That means like literally many forms of evil fly out and fly about. Right? So literally wander astray, but you have to kind of maybe be a little more creative with your translation. So let's talk about the grammar on this one. So multiformae is our subject. How do we know that? Well, the context, but also the verb is in the third person plural. What's tricky on this one is the E, because that is second declension genitive singular. So that's where we're getting many forms of evil. So that's probably the hardest word to maybe translate. So many forms of evil. It's where we get words like maliciousness and malevolent. Think of Snow White, malevolence, things like that. So many forms of evil rush forth. In fact, that sounds a little bit better. Rush forth and literally fly about. Yeah, in other words, they're out of control. But Pandora preserves hope in the box. So she closes it. Everything gets out except for the hope, which is, for example, this is where we get words like inspiration. Inspiration is a kind of hope. And so notice it's EM because third declension, which we haven't had yet, but third declension accusative singular is EM. And so here, no, actually it's fifth declension. So excuse me. So fifth declension, which is EM. So accusative, fifth declension. I think I mentioned before, most words in Latin, most nouns are the first three declensions, believe it or not. So even if we were doing Cicero, Caesar, or Virgil, most of the words are the first three declensions, but we have a couple that aren't. Remember, the Romans didn't use this. This is just something that grammarians put together through the centuries to help us learn Latin, but this is not something that the Romans really had as a working grammar. It was they didn't really have writing like we have it today. It was more of a spoken language, unless you were Virgil or Ovid or some great author. You can imagine both the technology and just the culture of writing really didn't exist. But Pandora preserves or conserves, but maybe preserves hope in the box. We talked about how this is going to be ablative singular because it's where is she keeping it in the box. So there's our ablative. And then the last line of these extra wheel locks, supplementary readings, tries to give you some moral of the story. So sometimes these read a little bit abstract and because it's like a moral, like in fables. And here we have, even if life is full of evils, we always have hope. So even if, so here we go, even. And then vita, where we get vital signs, life, and then full, and then plus the genitive. So then we have malorum, because second declension genitive plural is orum. So even if life is full of bad things or of evils or misfortunes, again, just choose one. We, mus, always, semper, habe, hope. So that is our direct object. So even if life is full of misfortunes, we always have hope. All right, so that's this week's lesson. It should help you on the test. I will be sending out an email explaining how you're going to sign up to come take your test. As always, please email me if you have any questions. Valete.